Wait.
Thank you for waiting. My name is Sheila Baumgartner. I'm with Robinson Spangler, Carolina Redmond. I've been with the library since 1988, and I see that I think I need to retire soon because the dates mixed up. I want to thank Sara, Gagne, Dr. Gagne for coming. Excuse me.
No, that's fine.
My bench here. For coming the last minute. And I really, please give her a warm welcome, and I'll shut up because I know you got things.
I'm just gonna grab a cheat sheet here for a second, just in case I need it. Fine. Yeah, so I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you for waiting. I was actually really looking forward to this. And actually was going to contact Bill next week to get together and talk about the photos because he did. Is that okay? Yeah, I won't move. I'll try not to move around too much. He did the photos for this new book that we've published, Nature at Your Door, and really the photos make the book. They're so excellent, and you'll see examples of those in the talk. So I won't talk for too long. And what I'm going to talk about, I do have bird stuff in here. I've got other stuff as well, other taxa in here. But I want to talk about first a couple of ideas that motivated me writing this book, and that have to do with generally nature in cities. So next slide. And we can go to the next slide. So this is one of Bill's excellent photographs in northern water snake. So if you can just go 3 clicks, and my 3 messages will pop up here. So I want to get across, and I think a lot of people are talking about this now, that nature is alive and well where you live. So there is a lot of nature. There are many species, as you are probably aware, in terms of birds in cities. So the more we look, the more we find. And that's one major message of the book and of my continuing research and more of what I'm doing. What I'd like to get across to the general public, so definitely you folks, but also folks who are not members of Mecklenburg Audubon, right? Just city dwellers, is that nature is all around you and that you're essentially connected into an urban ecosystem. So species and ecological interactions are occurring where you live. Just like a forest is an ecosystem, a city is an ecosystem which humans are a part. And we play a major role in that ecosystem. And because we're a part of that ecosystem and we're interconnected with other species and other processes, so we affect nature and it in turn affects us, means that we can exert great change in urban ecosystems and elsewhere, right? So we play a major role in urban ecosystems. We can make major changes. And as I'll talk about in a second, in an urban ecosystem, it's very complex. We're all making daily decisions about whether to take the car or not, whether to turn down the thermostat or not. And those all add up and make a significant impact on the conservation of species and our environment, or essentially the health of our environment. So a big thing about this was also you can enhance nature at your door. You can actually, there are many, and here I've come up with 75 in this book, many ways that you can take action to change the natural environment where you live, whether it's with respect to bird habitat or the quality of aquatic habitats where you live, or a variety of different things, butterfly habitats, all kinds of things. So I touch on that in the book. The next slide, please. Okay, so I'll try this out. So I want you in the analogy I'm trying to make here is if you just relax for a second and close your eyes and imagine you're 10 or 12 and you're back at the planetarium where you went with your school trip. Hopefully other people did this. I did this. Maybe this is somewhat familiar. So the lights have dimmed and you're kind of bored and you're not sure what's going to go on, and then you see a picture of our blue and white planet, right kind of above you. So you look at that, and then that starts moving away. So you picture that moving away. Then you start seeing different planets come into view. You might see the Kuiper Belt, and you're pulling away and starting to see more and more and more stars. And then you're pulling away into the arm of the Milky Way, and you're surrounded by a dense halo of stars around you. And you keep pulling away, and you see the Milky Way. Then, and you see this spiral that is also our home. And then that spiral becomes one of these little galaxies here, these multicolored galaxies that make up the universe. And I want people to look at nature in cities, especially, because that's where about 85% of Americans live, cities and towns. I want people to look at cities as biodiverse as this image of the vast universe that's just been created in your head with all its stars and galaxies and planets, that it is just as rich as this analogy implies, exactly where you live. So next slide, please. So examples of this, and we're going to do a little non-bird stuff for a little while. So during the pandemic, I stayed home. My son is now 4. I actually gave a talk to this group when I was pregnant. Yeah, so right before I gave birth. So during the pandemic, we were home for a while, which turned out to be really fun. And I discovered iNaturalist and just hanging out outside and finding species. And I soon thought, well, okay, I'm going to try to find different spider species. And these are all spiders that I found, I think, in 2 days. Not a huge amount, but I was also already a little interested that I could find an ant mimicking spider, which is this one here. And then these other 3 spiders just did about, 15 minutes in my home. Tan crab spider on a desk in my son's room, bull jumping spider near the back door, and then I can't remember where this jumping spider was, in some kind of cloth or something. And I was inspired, I was interested by all these things I found, and inspired by a project that was occurring in Australia. So 2 postdocs in Brisbane in Australia had started doing something similar. They had a lot more equipment and a lot more invertebrate skills than I did. And they soon found 1,000 species, mostly invertebrates, some birds, some mammals, etc., mostly invertebrates in their home and yard. So tons of moths, tons of butterflies, tons of spiders. And it took them, I think, over a year. So if you can imagine that species accumulation curve over time. At first, they found lots of stuff, but then it took them a little while to find other things. So actually, if you go to, so this was their tally. So 747 moths and insects, 97 plants, 53 bird species, 38 spiders, 14 fungi, 9 lizards, 8 mammals, and 2 amphibians. And if you think of Mecklenburg County, the stat that I like the most is that they've counted Mecklenburg County Nature Preserves and Natural Resources. The last I checked counted 899 species of moth in the county, which I think is amazing. That's something like 1 moth per 1,200 residents or something. So which is, I think, smaller than Sedgefield in terms of number of people, or maybe the size of Sedgefield where I live, so the number of people. So I think that's really cool. Okay, so next slide, please. I'm going to actually skip the next. You'll have to, this is, and I apologize for this just because of the mix up in the date. These are actually slides that don't apply here. This is another location. So just keep cycling through. These are, if you're interested, these are species that I'm going to show to another group. And if this is actually Columbus, Ohio, so I'm making the point that. So if we'll go through, so gray egrets, American woodcock, Swainson's thrush, this is all downtown Columbus, peregrine, milk snake, redback, cricket frog, northern map turtle, swift river cruiser, of course our coyotes, scurfy twiglet I chose because that's an interesting name. Philadelphia fleabane, Carolina mantis, spiders, beaver, dead man's fingers. I love the names of fungi. They're amazing. Bent line darter, and then there might be one more. Steel color shiner. So I think if we do this, and I didn't have time to do this, but if you did this, this is iNaturalist data. And so who has used, so it's not eBird, it's iNaturalist. Who's used iNaturalist before? eBird. iNaturalist uses the power of the community and AI to help you identify species. So you can take a photograph of an animal or a plant. It'll provide suggestions, photographic suggestions to help you identify that. And then your observation becomes research grade, and that's actually used in research if 2 out of 3 community members agree with your identification. So you need other people on iNaturalist or on iNaturalist, and there's lots of experts to say, yes, this is scurfy twiglet. Maybe that wasn't research grade, but, or maybe it was. And so it's an incredible resource. And I actually thought that downtown Columbus had fewer observations than I was expecting. I'm pretty sure the last time I looked at Charlotte, it was denser in terms of number of observations. Next slide, please. And what this shows, this is a boring graph, but it's an old graph, 2007, but it's a really, really important graph that maybe some of you know, and I know, but I keep forgetting, and my students always find astounding, is that there is a significant positive correlation or association between human population density and species richness of these groups of birds, mammals, plants, threatened species, restricted species in terms of the size of their ranges, and introduced species, which you might expect. But this means that the more people occur in an area, the more species, other species you are likely to find there. Wow. So that is a global pattern. It depends a little bit on spatial scale. So if you look at really small areas like this room, that's not the case, right? But generally, if you look at typically larger areas, that is the case. So humans and other species are finding typically places near water to occur, places that are energetically rich, right? So at kind of lower latitudes, typically more people occur, lower elevations, and then places that are typically more heterogeneous in the types of habitats. So humans like to have some water, different water features, open areas, closed areas, and we build stuff as well. But species, you get more species when you have different types of habitats. So this is a pattern that occurs across the world, and we really need to remember it. It means that we've got a huge amount to learn in cities about the species that we live amongst, and a huge responsibility to make cities, to conserve what we have in cities and make them better for species, because we can get even more than we have now. Next slide, please. So this is to show you that nature is alive and well where you live. So next slide, please. What I would actually, can you just click forward, please? So go back one slide. Sorry, just trying to gather my thoughts. So I won't belabor this too much, but to highlight that we're living amongst all of these different species, and we're sharing an ecosystem with these species. So all of the processes that you can infer that are occurring in this slide, so plant growth, photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, animal movement, etc., soil formation, nutrient cycling, all of those things that are happening here that we're really comfortable with happening here are happening on the next slide. So if we go here, all those things are happening here. And we know that we've got, in some cases, just as much or more species here than in the previous slide. And unfortunately, I don't have these slides, but there's a meta-analysis that shows that if we look along an urban gradient, so from forested to exurban, kind of low density residential development, suburban and urban, suburban and urban places along that gradient are the places with the most birds of any species, the most bird biomass. And then those places have, the suburban part of the gradient has the highest percentage out of the exurban and urban of the undeveloped land. So 75% of the species that occur in the forest or undeveloped land occur in suburban areas. So this is an important ecosystem for birds and people. And if we can go to, and again, please. That's fine. So we're sharing the big elements in our urban ecosystem. We play a major role. Luckily, I put a bird here, so we've got birds as our fellow species, and we have the physical environment. So these are the components or the elements that make up an ecosystem. So biological and inorganic elements interacting. And I've put here a little thought bubble. So the other special thing about an urban ecosystem is that we bring in the social component. There's lots of urban ecologists now studying how people's behaviors, how institutional policies, how planning practices, government structures, etc., impact the ecological interactions and the ecological processes that occur in cities. So I published a paper recently called the likability, therefore abundant hypothesis. And the idea is and it had to do with birds actually. So if there are birds that you like seeing in your yard, that you find beautiful, like Eastern bluebirds, for example, you are more likely to make changes to your yard to provide habitat for them or remove disturbances, and those individual actions built up across a city can potentially impact the population persistence of those species. And the bluebird is the perfect example. So I think the bluebird is benefiting from nest boxes that people have put up in cities and elsewhere. And so that's why the thought, that kind of social component, is really important. So I'll move on, actually. I'll just, we could go to the next slide. And then I'll just make a point here in the next clip. So my point here is when we're talking about urban, we are certainly talking about, and this is what we often think of, downtown cores, right? So we're talking about that. But if we're talking about urban ecosystems, we're thinking about all kinds of different built landscapes, whether they're very exurban, suburban, and everything in between. And the thing that connects these places, so if we think of the larger Charlotte, Gastonia, I can't remember, maybe Rock Hill, I can't remember the exact name of the metropolitan area, the census statistical area. But all those places are considered urban and everything in between. So it's places that are linked to each other either by the movement of people or the movement of air, water, and species. So our forests that we study that don't look urban at all, but they're in this larger metro area, are urban forests, right? They're impacted potentially by the pollution from Charlotte, certainly water quality from Charlotte, introduced species, their movement, etc. So that's just important to keep in mind. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I think I've shown you can be just as connected to nature in your town or city as elsewhere. And then there's lots of stuff you can do, and I can get to the bird stuff now with the next slide. So this is my dean's backyard. Bill and I were lucky enough, we went to a retirement party for a colleague in our department, and I looked at his backyard and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. He lives in Plaza Midwood. It's just astounding. And so we made kind of an appointment to go photograph his backyard, but I don't know if he was coming. So we just kind of went in and took tons of photographs. So this is the, you know, an ideal backyard for birds. So next slide, please. And then two clicks. So each of the chapters in the book, I should have said, are organized by space. So the first one is your yard. And so in each chapter, I go through how you impact nature in that space, and then again, how it impacts you in that space. And for each of those kind of subsections, I give lots of recommendations about how you can enhance nature with respect to that theme. So the two messages here for your yard, and your yard has to do heavily with birds, is how you manage nature in your yard matters just as much or more to birds than how much green space there is nearby, which if you take a second to think about it, it's just like crazy. And then the second one, so that's how we impact birds. The second one is experiencing nature in your yard leads to love and care for the environment. So the idea that we can overcome this extinction of experience or a lack of awareness and connection with nature right where we live. You don't have to go to a park or preserve to do that. You can do that right at home. So I can, just to finish up here, I can give you some evidence that shows the first half of this. So next slide. So what I've been able to find is evidence from 4 different cities. So next slide. So this is from Ottawa. So I did my PhD in Ottawa. And this is meant to show that this kind of astounding fact. So if you think of the green space in Charlotte or in other cities, so just the green area, in a lot of cities that actually makes up more than 50% of the available habitat for birds, right? So if you think of trees and green space and habitat for birds, we're not counting our house sparrow, that is at least the plurality or majority of the habitat compared to parks and nature preserves. My colleague at the time went out to Ottawa and he measured the effect of the amount of private yard green space and the amount of public green space. And he found that they have just as much an influence on the number of native bird species in Ottawa, the number of bird species who primarily depend on forest, and the number of threatened species. So increasing vegetation in your yard makes just as much a difference as having another park on the number of threatened species that occur in cities. So that means you can have a huge impact. And then next slide, please. In Phoenix, they went and measured yards and desert birds in yards. Birds in neighborhoods responded twice as much to habitat features in front yards than to the distance to the nearest tract of desert habitat. And they found about maybe 2/3, I can't really remember, but a good proportion of the desert bird community was occurring in yards in Phoenix. And then next slide. Similarly, in Chicago, the number of bird species counted along residential streets is dependent to a greater extent on the wildlife resources in yards than on the area of open space, including forest preserves within 2/3 of a mile. So the birds that are occurring in your yard are depending on your yard. They're not depending on any green space or less so near you. And then in Hobart, New Zealand, garden characteristics had a bigger influence on the number and different types of native birds and the number of woodland birds in gardens than distance to native vegetation. So our yards are able to welcome a significant number of threatened species, nominally woodland or forest species. We've got lots of those in Sedgefield, and native species. And in everything but Ottawa, the yard vegetation was mostly what birds were counting on for their occurrence and richness. So for bird diversity, is what's in your yard and your neighbor's yards. So next slide, please. This is an excellent photo. So if you click forward 3 times. The second message here is that it's not massive changes that you have to make to your yard to have a positive impact on birds. So I took these 3 effect sizes from 3 of the papers. So in Ottawa, if landscapes think there were 2/3 of a mile radius. If they contained 10% more yard vegetation, they saw a 20% bump in forest dependent or threatened bird species. So that's not that much more vegetation for a pretty good bump. 50% of the desert bird community was counted in yards if they contained, so it's like kind of like a block of yards, just 10 desert tree species and 20 shrubs. And then this was in Chicago. If you had 10% more yards along a street with at least one plant with fruit or berries, you get 2 more bird species.
Wow.
So there's really not, you know, these are big effects. You can actually make significant changes. And I think if we go to the next slide, I'll leave you with one of the sets of recommendations. And it took Bill forever to get this beautiful shot, which you probably don't like, but I have a paper that I just read that says maybe it's okay. I've collated from those papers and other research 5 things you can do to improve your quality of your yard as bird habitat, because it is so important. 1, simply just add more vegetation to your yard. If you're able to get rid of some driveway or somehow add a tree or a garden, just do that in any way. 2, choose plant species that attract birds. And you probably know that the Audubon Society has like a native plant list that indicate different characteristics that would attract different species. Diversify the type and structure of vegetation in your yard. If you can have herbaceous plants, have some lawn, some herbaceous plants, some woody shrubs, some climbing vines, and some deciduous and coniferous trees. So the more species diversity of plant and the more structural vertical diversity of plant, the more bird species you'll get. And you can think of trees as kind of smaller trees like dogwoods or larger trees. And then it tends to be important to have coniferous trees. So a mix of deciduous and coniferous. We're often planting deciduous. So coniferous is good to add because then you'll get some waxwings and a whole suite of other things. Provide supplemental food for birds. I think there's reasonable confidence now that feeding birds is net positive. There's a large study in the UK that it led to population increases in common birds over time. It helps keep birds alive over winter, and these are bigger benefits than some diseases that occur that can be spread. So definitely feed birds ethically and cleanly, so you're not spreading diseases with that. And then if you can, keep your cat indoors. I don't keep my cat indoors because I have the cat and I don't feel like that's fair to the cat, and you can yell me out of here. But I do use this Birds Be Safe collar. And that there was an independent study that showed that it reduced bird mortality by 82%. And I have to say, just anecdotally, I put it on all the time, and it does have an effect. So he was bringing stuff home, he's not bringing stuff home anymore. So I think, and so hopefully, that's having effect. But basically, I think if we're gonna reach people in terms of cats, we have to offer them a variety of different management strategies, right? That work with their life.
Your cat self-esteem drop.
It did. It did. So it took him, I think probably like 5 months. Like maybe midsummer he was okay with it. Yeah, it took a while. But he looks good. He looks quite happy here. So yeah, so there's a variety of different things you can do with cats, right? They've got catios, keeping them inside. This Bird Be Safe collar, which I think works pretty well. And I think I've definitely talked for enough, and I will leave it there. So thank you for staying. I'm very glad to be here. And yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Well, from Mecklenburg organization, I have a question. Maybe you guys can help me. I let my back garden, which is very small, for a while. And I know my neighbors do it, but you know, as things, the flowers die down, the plants down, we got all the machete the stuff there. Like get rid of the, I would just put it down, put a little pile, and then they can come get stuff they want to use it for next year.
You could leave some of it up because they use that for cover in the winter.
That's what I,
And if you have any plants that have seeds or berries on them, they'll feed those too.
I'll be very saying.
You gotta plant so that plants are hardy.
Yeah.
And that way we have less maintenance.
Oh, I know, that most everything is either herbal or something I planted, or it just sort of came up.
So Sheila, what was the initial question to not clear what?
Oh, I just didn't want to, I don't like my neighbors to think I don't care, it's just that I don't think it's anything. But I do this for the birds and the rabbits and the little critters that come around my house, because that's how I do it. I don't have a big backyard like you look at. So I just was trying to figure out a way to slow it down.
Oh, okay, how to mow.
Like I say, you're a
Right.
trendsetter though, because the natural yard is now okay.
Yeah, I mean.
So you just look at your neighbors and go like,
Yeah.
dude.
Well, that's the good thing is, fans, I mean, my next door neighbor, invited me last week, but I'm like, yeah. So bad. Oh, and we have links for sale.
Yes.
But we have one question. How long did it take you to do the studies for the, it's a beautiful book. I mean,
Repeat the
writing,
question.
the writing was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I wrote it in 10 months,
Wow.
I think. Yeah, so, but I prepped it for a while before. Yeah, I basically decided in the pandemic, I'm gonna do this.
But I think it's been 4 years since I've seen you, and
Yeah,
what's his name?
Truman.
Great name.
Other questions?
We have one here.
Any plant suggestions right off the bat in Charlotte area?
What?
Or if you're trying to and attract birds and.
So the question is, any suggestions for the Charlotte area? I think the biggest thing, so based on this research, is try to get rid of lawn in Charlotte. So replace as much lawn with herbaceous plants, fruit-bearing plants, as we can. Try to keep our tree canopy. Our tree canopy is declining really rapidly. So there is currently a remote sensing study looking at the current state of tree canopy. And I think that'll be completed in December and coming out next spring. So the city is trying to get on top of the canopy. I think they're gonna have a wildlife study soon. I think the city is trying to do as much as they can. But I think the yard and kind of changing the aesthetic, so the natural yard, right? It depends what neighborhood you live in, but I think there's a lot more, like in Gardening magazine.
You keep an eye on the TV commercials, the driveways have the bricks with the grass growing.
Yeah,
inside and
exactly,
stuff like
yeah.
that, so.
So just add more vegetation, more plants.
I think that herbs are really good for attracting birds and different types of.
Yeah.
animals. And Joe Ivy, which you mentioned before.
Yeah.
My favorites. Bebop is really good for, it is really, yeah, hummingbirds and, anything. The reason I like birds is, you know, it's drought resistant. I mean, I'm a fan of gardening because one, there's a farmer's market, and two, I wasted so much money in water. When I could just go down to the farmer's market to get. And so,
Yeah.
it's like, man.
The other thing we've done is in our back 40, which is not 40, it's just like a tiny back corner behind our herb garden. We've just let it go crazy. And so I took out, like every once in a while, I'm like, there's too much mix. So I just like take that out and see what else comes. But we got these thistles and these other things, and the thistles dried up, and I feel like there's been tons of American goldfinches this year, but I've never had them in my yard before. So they're all over the thistles, all over that kind of back area. We've got hummingbirds, and that's like far enough away you can kind of look at it, right? And you've got your binoculars. So that's another fun thing to do, just having like a spontaneous wild patch. Yeah.
Everything I hear about is sun-loving flowers. So like
Okay.
my backyard has a lot
Yeah.
of trees. And so I have a lot of shade. So I mean, other than like houseplants,
Yeah.
Deer that, like,
Their columbines are good. There are some shade first, but I can't think of them.
So we're talking about shade, yeah, shade, I think shrubs, I think there might be enough like shade, if you wanna try birds, like if you can find some shade loving shrubs, like rhododendrons might be one, I'm not like a super huge plant person, but that seems like it might be a fruitful.
There's
area.
some asters and there's some.
Asters, okay.
What do I got? I got a really shady one.
Okay.
I've got cardinals, I put a lot of stuff in pots too, so.
Okay.
But anyway, we need to.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah. Thank you so much, yeah, hopefully we can talk.